you saying that anybody who's appointed to an agency, board, or commission in Ontario should not have any tinge whatsoever of political association?
No, I think you have both. I think you have the government prerogative, you have the political aspect, but you also have the competency aspect. And I think that the trick is to marry the two. And you no doubt will have political, competencies, but if you if you understand the business, if you're, financially literate, these corporations are major, significant, including the not-for-profit, aspects of our economy, and they oversee resources, they oversee very important aspects, and it's absolutely critical that we have the right people at the helm and that they be selected properly. So I think government is going through a transition right now where it's saying, listen, we have this political process, we've always used it, but the world is changing. We've got technology, we've got risk, we have to incorporate some of these best practices into our own appointment system.
Stephen?
I was just going to say that,
we've lost the bigger picture here, which is, are these agencies actually doing an effective job for us, which presumably is what, at the end of the day, we ought to care about. Is
That's
that person right?
We're not looking at the cost of a paper clip or the cost of Timbits. It's the untendered contracts. It's the lack of it's what happened with OLG with the lottery tickets. It's the risks. It's the financial impropriety. It's who is at the helm and how did they get there and what are their responsibilities and are they qualified and what are they doing their job. If you look at any major corporation in Canada, you can tell that. You can't tell that by looking at the Ontario government.
This all then comes to a whole question of metrics when you're dealing with ongoing basis, not just once a year even.
Richard.
Well, if someone is trained on a board of directors in the publicly traded sector, the requirements for disclosure now, you're even obligated to disclose your training record that you've done over the last year. We don't have any of that. We don't understand how the education program works, how the training program works, what the expectations are. And why not? If you're coming onto a board of directors or an agency or a commission, how are you trained?
It's interesting.
I know I trained other provinces on other Crown corporations, 80 or 90 corporate directors in a room for a whole day. Is that happening in Ontario? We don't know.
I doubt it. I really doubt it because you know what? Unlike
That's right.
I think they learned their lesson about that.
That's right.
Richard, let me ask you this. As you analyze this, did it seem to you that these, you want to call them mistakes, improprieties, whatever you want to call them, do you think they happened because people were just out and out flouting the rules, or was it more a case of the rules weren't all that clear?
No, I think the rules are there. They need to be enforced, and they need to be adequately ensured by the board of directors and by the audit committee. But if the board is composed of political appointees that aren't selected on the basis of competencies and aren't overseeing the risks and the internal controls and the internal audit and the external auditor appropriately, then you're going to have a culture of entitlement. And ultimately, the buck stops with the board of directors. And you have to go back to how the board is selected. Boards in the private sector now, there's a competency matrix so that you have to bring certain people on the board that understand the industry, understand the business. The Ontario Lottery Gaming Corporation it's a $6 billion corporation, and it had 6 directors, and I think their pay was, $10,000 a year. The government has to impose the same sort of expectations on its own Crown corporations that other provinces are doing, and has to engage in, bringing on the right people so that they can adequately oversee the controls and oversee what's happening within the organization. So in my mind, the buck stops really with the board of directors.
So just by way of comparison, if you were in the private sector running a $6 billion corporation and you were a board member, what would your compensation likely be?
Anywhere between $50,000 and $100,000
yeah,
for a corporation that size.
Not 10.
Not 10. And you get what you pay for at the end of the day.
And you would be spending a significant period of time in oversight.
Probably 20 to 30, for a corporation that size, probably 20 to 40 working days a year. And that's just as a board member, not chairing a committee.
And plus, you're going to be fiscally literate on that
you're
board
going to have
as well.
Financial literacy expectations.
Secondly,
exactly.
as you were saying earlier on, unlike government agencies, you're going to have a governance committee. You're going to have an HR committee. You're going to have an audit committee. Everyone participates on these things, but it gives you a template of accountability that isn't necessarily there with the public sector.
But David, we don't know that, because if you go to the Ontario Crown Corporation websites, I mean, I had to drill down to the LCBO to find out the board of directors in an annual report. The financial statements for the OLG were listed under the media tab. And they just listed the directors. And if you go to any top TSX 100 company, within 2 or 3 clicks, you can find out, who's the board, what competencies do they have, what meetings did they attend, what are the mandates of the committees. You don't find any of that in Crown Corporation.
Why do you suppose not?
I don't know. Why won't the
try
government?
something?
Why won't McGuinty
They haven't had to.
impose? They haven't had to.
Well, let's do a little history lesson here. Herschel is now going to tell us, because of his vast experience in government, about what they call the signal. You're right. What do you say?
The only ironic thing I see is that the Ontario Securities Commission, which is responsible for regulating all the publicly traded companies in Canada, 3 or 4 years ago has said to all TSX-listed companies, we want to see a code of conduct, we want to see a board mandate, we want to see an audit committee mandate, we want to see position descriptions on your website. The New York Stock Exchange this week is having greater disclosure requirements for its listed companies on its websites. And when you go to the websites of various Ontario Crown corporations, the disclosure, and Steve, this would interest you, given your emphasis on shareholder disclosure, the disclosure is minimal at best. I mean, the Ontario Lottery Gaming, and I said this about a year ago, had an audit committee disclosure that was 3 lines long. And that, in today's day and age, is wholly inadequate. So whether you're a shareholder on the outside or a taxpayer and you're looking in, the disclosure of corporate governance practices and policies and expectations is opaque at best and minimal, and in some cases wholly inadequate.
David Tabucci, let me give a list of what seem to be the alleged improprieties here, and then I want to